Welcome back to Act 2 of Deconstructing Directing, Our Directing Identity. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. In this act, we are exploring who a director is and how we develop and hone our sense of self as directors. In Scene 1, we talked about our why, or the driving force behind our work as directors. And today we're going to explore something that often gets in the way of developing our why: imposter syndrome. As we discussed in Act 1, a part of our job as directors is to be facilitators. And one of the facilitation skills we can build is specificity. So let's get specific by defining our terms. Psychology Today describes imposter syndrome as follows. People who struggle with imposter syndrome believe that they are undeserving of their achievements and the high esteem in which they are, in fact, generally held. They feel that they aren't as competent or intelligent as others might think, and that soon enough people will discover the truth about them. Those with imposter syndrome, which is not an official diagnosis, are often well accomplished. They may hold high office or have numerous academic degrees. We also know from research that while imposter syndrome can happen to anyone, I deal with it every time I create one of these videos, it is more common in women, people of color, and those who have been marginalized by society. As you may have already noticed, being a director, especially if we understand the role to be responsible for holding the sole vision in a production, is a position ripe for imposter syndrome. As directors, we are immediately granted power that brings with it being seen as an expert and being held in higher esteem than those around us. That can feel unearned, especially if we are new to directing, and thus induce a lot of anxiety about the fact that we will be found out as an imposter, someone who is not deserving of that level of esteem. While I can't know the context of everyone who will watch, read, and or listen to this scene, it was created with upstream directors in mind. These are the directors who work in community theater and educational theater contexts, many of whom become directors out of necessity or because they were voluntold. So if you are someone like an athletics coach who got tasked with directing the one-act play at a small school, or the person that the community theater begged to direct because they didn't have anyone else, the imposter syndrome might feel particularly acute. But before we talk more about imposter syndrome and how we handle it, let's dig a little deeper to try and understand why we feel imposter syndrome. Specifically, I want to explore the benefits of imposter syndrome, which might seem like a strange idea. Pretty much everywhere you look, imposter syndrome is seen as a bad thing, something we have to fight against and eventually try to eliminate from our lives, and that still may be true. But the reality is that just like any part of our psychology, at least some part of our brain sees value in this way of thinking. Our minds are always going to do the thing that they believe will benefit us the most. So let's talk about the benefit of imposter syndrome. It's a disaster preparedness protocol. Imposter syndrome is our brain preparing us for a worst-case scenario. I mean, that's the ultimate fear with imposter syndrome, right? That we will be discovered as an imposter and disaster will result. That disaster could be a fear of abandonment, a fear of punishment, a fear of perpetuating harm, among others. Imposter syndrome is essentially our brains trying to prepare us for this disaster by ensuring that we never stop worrying about the possibility. And if we don't stop thinking about it, then when it eventually happens, our more base instincts are not so great about subtleties, so it's never if it happens, it's always when. It won't surprise us, and therefore it won't hurt as much, or at least that's the idea. This is why we perpetuate a lot of harmful beliefs and ideas about ourselves and the world around us, because at some level, those beliefs and ideas are perceived by part of our brains as helpful to our continued existence. There's a worksheet in the usual spot on our website, free to access, and I'll put a link in the description of the video or podcast, to help you think through the possible purpose of your own imposter syndrome. The key, then, to addressing something like imposter syndrome is to acknowledge why it is there and to help teach the parts of our brain that are scared of the perceived worst-case scenario that we don't need to prepare for it in that way any longer. In addition, we can give ourselves new tools to help ease our anxiety about that possible outcome. So let's examine both of these means of addressing it. Showing ourselves we don't have to be as worried about it happening as we might think, and giving ourselves additional tools to prepare for the worst case scenario that can lessen the need for our minds to perpetuate the imposter syndrome. In a lot of the research around imposter syndrome, an interesting correlation was discovered. People with imposter syndrome tended to be more other-focused, meaning that we tend to be much more aware of other people's needs, feelings, and ideas. Now, this makes sense, since imposter syndrome usually keeps us obsessing over how others perceive us, and we can only know that by paying close attention to how they interact with us. Now, this focus on others may not be something that we do consciously, but by making it a conscious intention, we can direct it more effectively. In fact, some of the skills in our flame paradigm of directing are very intentionally focused on others, like facilitation and management. If the flame paradigm is new to you, check out Act 1, Defining Directing, for more on that. By focusing on these skills, it can help to pull us out of the, they're going to find out I'm an imposter thought spiral, by reducing our belief that as directors, we have to be the expert on anything. Back in Act 1, Defining Directing, we talked about why we don't believe in the idea that a director has to have the vision for a piece of work. And one of the main issues with this way of thinking is that it puts way too much pressure on the director. If everyone around you is telling you that this project sinks or swims entirely on your vision, that is fertile soil for imposter syndrome. But what happens if instead we define the role of a director as we do with the flame paradigm, being much more about supporting and guiding those involved? All of a sudden we have less to worry that we'll be seen as an imposter about, because we're not presenting ourselves as anything other than what we are. People who are invested in a production and want to make it successful alongside everyone else. When we take some of that pressure off of ourselves, we lessen the places for imposter syndrome to worm its way in. That said, if that's too big of a shift for you at this point in your growth, that's okay. Let's talk about some tools we have at our disposal to address it when we start to notice it. First, let's explore positive self-talk. Self-talk is something we all have or do, but it may present itself differently. It can be negative, like, I'll disappoint everyone if I don't go to the pool party, or positive, I'm so good at this. Some folks might hear these words spoken in their mind, some might see an image that creates those emotions in them, yet others may just have feelings and have a hard time putting words to them. The key to reframing is to focus on things that you can control. I'll use an example of self-talk that I struggle with. In this case, the idea, if I fail, no one will ever want to work with me again. It wouldn't be helpful to reframe this thought as, everyone will want to work with me even if I fail, because I can't control that. I have no idea what everyone will think. Instead, I might reframe it as, I will be proud of myself for making the effort even though I'm scared. That reframe is focused wholly on me and is something that I can control. There's a worksheet below that will help you put words to your own self-talk and a structure to reframe our negative thoughts into positive ones. Doing this activity may feel a little silly at first, but if you keep at it, eventually you'll start to be able to do it in the moment when you have those imposter syndrome thoughts, and thus rob them of their power. Another tool that can be helpful when dealing with imposter syndrome thoughts is to ask others about them. This is not necessarily something you'll want to do with someone you've just met, but author and researcher Brené Brown explains that the only way to deal with shame, and what is imposter syndrome if not a kind of shame, is by learning to be vulnerable. She talks about how she and her husband use the phrase, the story I'm telling myself is, ... when they perceive that the other is upset with them. This is a phrase my husband and I have adopted with great effect, and something I try to do in professional contexts as well. Sometimes naming our fear allows those around us to reassure us, and other times it provides them the opportunity to share with us the parts of our perceptions that are true so that we can discuss them openly with the goal of moving forward together. Now, this can be very hard to do when we're actively on edge about the way that others perceive us. So at the end of this act, we're going to dedicate an entire scene just to how we as directors can practice regulating our own nervous system and emotions. So we'll dig more into this then. Well, who knew there was so much to discuss about imposter syndrome, huh? As a recap, imposter syndrome comes about because our brains are trying to protect us from a worst-case scenario. We can help retrain our brains to be less worried about that by changing the way we perceive our role, reducing the pressure we place on ourselves and allow others to place on us. We can also learn to reframe our negative self-talk, be vulnerable and open about our worries, and improve our own self-regulation. And we need to remember that, like any work that deals with our own psychology, progress isn't linear. Even once we start getting better at addressing it, it'll still show up. The good news is that the more we can face it head on, the better we get at doing exactly that. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry. You'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 2, Scene 3, Heroes, Role Models, and Individualization. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.